If your reader ever says, "Why don't they just say it?" you're closer to good writing than you think. Because people don't avoid solutions out of stupidity, they avoid them out of fear. Channel. I'm Jack Lawrence, award-winning and best-selling mystery writer and former therapist. And on this channel, Mind of the Writer, I show you the psychology behind human behavior, relationships, and connections to help you grow a better plot and characters. In therapy, we don't treat avoidance as some sort of weakness. What we treat it as is a form of protection. Generally, it's some sort of trauma response that people do in a way to protect themselves, whether physically or emotionally, based on the experience that they've had in past relationships and past people in their lives. Most often parents, but sometimes it could be other relationships that they've had as well. The things people tend to avoid most are any conversations that question their identity, actions that risk rejection, and truths that force change. I'm sure many of you, if you're a writer, you've experienced at least the second one, avoiding action that might lead to rejection. I've been part of a lot of writer groups on social media, as well as spoken at conferences and with writer groups. Something I hear a lot from particularly indie authors, but kind of authors in general, is that either they don't want to submit to agents or publishers because they're afraid of the rejection. They couldn't stomach the rejection. And they're terrified of getting any reviews because the reviews might be bad, and that in and of itself is a form of rejection. So rejection is something that everybody at some point in their life has dealt with, particularly going through school, right? You always want to fit in. There's a fear of being rejected. Growing up, a lot of times you do what your parents tell you to do because you don't want to be rejected by them. Even in work. And as a writer, something you can probably relate to, because at some point I can guarantee if you've written a word and had the hope of putting it out into the world, that thought of rejection has popped up at least once. I know it did for me. Once I started having some success, I wanted to maintain that success. So there's a fear that eventually that might run out and I start getting rejected. Now, at the end of the day, your character always knows the solution. They just can't afford what it might cost them emotionally, right? And so they know how to resolve the problem, but if they do, there's going to be some sort of emotional cost that they don't know that they can pay. One of the things your character is probably going to try to avoid is the loss of belonging, feeling like they don't belong somewhere. Connection is one of the primary things humans need for survival. As much as we like to pretend that we're individuals and that we can do things on our own, and we want our own unique individualism, at the end of the day, we want to feel like we belong somewhere. And even in that individualism, there's a sense of connection. If that's what's popular and that's what most people are aiming toward, you by default kind of belong to a community. So that fear of disconnect is a major motivator for most people, including your character. The other is shame or exposure, right? Sometimes the truth might feel worse than a consequence. If this person has done something where they feel ashamed, then they're going to want to hide that at all costs because they don't want that coming to light. And you might wonder, what is the difference between shame versus guilt? So guilt is, I've done something bad, I know it's bad. Where shame is, I've done something bad, that means something is wrong with me. So guilt is the action is bad, doesn't necessarily reflect on me, but I'm still guilty because I know I did something I shouldn't have. Where shame is a direct reflection of me, and I only did this because I'm bad. The other one is identity collapse. So kind of going back to the identity piece, fixing a problem would almost definitely require becoming somebody else, right? And so if Your character has a victim mentality where woe is me, they're always the underdog, always having this problem. No matter what, they can't get ahead. The world's always out to get them. For that problem to not exist, they would essentially have to change everything about themselves. Their beliefs, their thoughts, their actions, all of these things have to be different for this problem to change. Avoidance is something that always protects the person from something, right? It's either the emotional aspect, it's the discomfort of having to change something about themselves, particularly if they've created this idea that it's a strength, right? If they live in a victim mentality and they've identified this now as part of their strength, it's going to be really hard for them to want to change. What I see most often is that writers tend to delay confrontation arbitrarily. There's no real rhyme, reason, or even point to why they're putting off the confrontation of the character addressing this problem. They also withhold information artificially, right? They withhold it so that it feels like a twist. It feels like some major ta-da, but you're not really pulling the wool over the reader's eyes. What's happening is they're probably identifying this pretty soon because they either know people like this or they themselves on some level identify with it. So there is no real twist. It kind of feels cheap. It feels like you just don't care kind of about the story, and it certainly doesn't feel authentic because you're forcing the hold rather than letting it come organically. People also mistake silence for tension. This is something that I recognize a lot in therapy, where silence isn't tension most of the time. Most of the time it's just because the other person doesn't know how to respond. One of the best exercises we had when I was in grad school, we had to do a residency and we would do fake therapy sessions. And they drilled it into our heads, be comfortable in the silence. So when whoever we're working with would go quiet, we would essentially try to outlast them. Sure, it's uncomfortable, it doesn't feel great, especially when you feel like maybe you should be saying something, but that doesn't mean it's tense. That just means that the other person in therapy, the client, in your book, probably your main character, but maybe another character, they just don't know what to say. They don't know how to respond. Especially if this identity or this belief is being challenged, right? Because in that case, generally the only response is going to be aggressive or defensive. And those two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but they're going to probably err on one of those two. In reality, avoidance is usually pretty active. It's not a passive thing. A person knows that they're uncomfortable, right? A person knows that this isn't a situation they want to be in. It's one they don't want to deal with. They're not going to sit by passively. They're going to storm out. They're going to shut down. They're actively doing something to avoid whatever the problem is or whatever the situation is. They're not just there. Additionally, your character is constantly choosing not to act. And you can use this in internal dialogue or a monologue. You can do it through their actions, things like that, to show that not only are they actively trying not to address this issue, but they're justifying it because in their mind, it's the right thing to do. So now you're probably asking, well, how the hell do I write this? Definitely show it, right? You don't want to tell your reader that somebody's avoiding something because that takes all of the potential out of the scene. Showing that tension and that decision not to address something creates so much more for the reader than just telling them that this is happening. You can show your character using deflection, trying to leave, trying to change the subject, interrupting, pointing out the other person's flaws over their own. That's something people do a lot in real life. Busy work, right? If there's this thing that's kind of weighing over them and they need to address it soon, but they are doing mundane tasks to try to keep busy instead of addressing it, that's excellent. Humor at the wrong moment. Everybody knows that person who deflects with humor. Use that. That's excellent. Like I said, changing a topic suddenly when you're talking about something and all of a sudden they skirt off, it has nothing to do with the conversation. That's a great way to deflect. And avoid leaks, or show avoidant leaks even. On the other hand of that, where avoidant leaks are essentially the character is doing everything in their possible power to avoid connection. Because if there's connection, there's a threat that this, whatever it is that they're trying to avoid, is going to become known to the world. So they try to push away, they avoid that connection. If you found this video useful, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, because every week I give you psychological tips to help improve your writing and bring depths to your stories, your plots, and your characters.